Okay, Olivier, I think we can start then.
All right.
Yeah. Hello,
Let me
everybody.
share it. Yeah.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah. So welcome everybody to the second session of this that I will start. So this is joint work with Romain, um, where we see the link between the interaction between monetary policy and fiscal policy on the cost of debt in South Africa. Just let me briefly mention that the views expressed in this paper are only my own and do not reflect those of the Banque de France or the of the Euro system. So with this out of the way, let me start with a small motivation of the paper. Following the great financial crisis, we have seen large-scale fiscal expansions practically everywhere in both emerging markets or advanced economies with really mind-boggling numbers, but that will be probably dwarfed by the amount that we see now in the COVID crisis. So on the one hand, we have very large fiscal packages, but and it kind of renewed the interest in understanding the economic consequences of fiscal policy intervention, and in particular the size of the multipliers depending on tax or government spending multipliers. So it was really a time when fiscal economists said it's our time to shine, and you see that there's been a very large body of literature that has been created. So these programs were mainly financed through deficits and debt emission, and so I mean both in advanced economies or emerging markets, with a trend that is somewhat worrying, and these trends have spurred concerns about sustainability of debt. At this, so yes, so these programs were financed through deficits. Concerns about the sustainability of public debt resurfaced. To which extent do market participants even care about the size of the stock of debt? So really, there was these questions about the link between the stock of debt and the cost of financing, and we subscribe into this literature. At the same time, monetary policy has responded in an unprecedented fashion. So first through conventional instruments by lowering their policy rate to levels to very low levels, but I mean going even further with unconventional instruments, negative interest rates or asset purchase programs. So this really begs the question: how does the combination of monetary and fiscal policy affect sovereign range? So I want to stress that this interest has been spurred by the combination after the global financial crisis. But as Eric said yesterday, even in normal times, fiscal policy and monetary policy are intertwined. So the aim of this paper is to study the response of sovereign yields to fiscal policy shocks in South Africa between 1972 and 2019, so in an empirical fashion, taking into account monetary and fiscal policy regimes and their interaction. So to do this, we identify regime shifts in policy preferences with Markov switching regressions. On the one side, fiscal policy regime through some sort of fiscal policy feedback rule, and monetary monetary policy feedback rule. So the fiscal policy, we identify a passive and an active regime. I think this has been cleared yesterday. So for the passive fiscal policy, the aim is to stabilize the debt. And when fiscal policy is active, it does not try to stabilize the debt. When it comes to monetary policy regimes, we have one regime, which is the active regime, when the Taylor principle holds. So when the central bank reacts aggressively to inflation developments, and a passive behavior when the Taylor principle does not hold. So these two regimes, I mean, together can, do create four regimes. So monetary active, fiscal passive, monetary active, fiscal active, etc., etc. To link it to Eric's lecture yesterday, so the M regime would correspond to the monetary active and fiscal passive regime, and the F regime would correspond to monetary passive and fiscal active. Empirically, there can be two more regimes for which the implications theoretically are either an indeterminate price level in the MPFP and an explosive regime in the MAFA. So we will see empirically how these regimes matter. There's been a large and quite long debate about the impacts of deficit on sovereign yields, both theoretically and empirically. Theoretically, you have on the one side the Ricardian equivalence, which states that any deficit today will be offset by surpluses tomorrow, so that the intertemporal budget constraint of the household does not change, and there is no change in aggregate demand, and therefore no change in the demand for bonds or any effect on the interest rates. Empirically, again, it's really really ambiguous. There's been studies that find no effect, or effect only for large fiscal shocks, or shocks or only consider forecasted deficits and not realized deficits. So I mean, the theory and the empirics is not clear on this question. So this is where we come in. But there's one feature that seems important, is that nonlinearities seem to be an important feature to detect effects of fiscal policy. So that's the rest of the outline for the rest of the talk. So I will now I will now go through the methodology. So as I said, we use a feedback rule, some type of Taylor rule, but for the fiscal authority, where the current deficit depends on its own lag, so to capture some inertia, the output gap to capture the cyclicality in fiscal policy, and the stabilizing deficit. So I will come in a moment what is the stabilizing deficit, even though it was talked about in the previous presentation. So you see that this rule is indexed by a STF, so it's the stance of fiscal policy at time t, and it can swing between a passive and an active state. To identify the two regimes, we assume that for the passive fiscal policy, the dynamics is non-explosive, so the rho is smaller than 1, the constant is 0, and the current deficit targets the stabilizing deficit, so it moves 1-to-1 with the stabilizing deficit. So the stabilizing deficit is derived from the debt accumulation equation, where current debt depends past debt and the current deficit. IDT is the implied interest rate, so the interest payment in period T divided by the stock of debt at T minus 1, and G is the growth of GDP. So if we want to stabilize the debt to GDP, we set BT equals to BT minus 1, and we can obtain a time series for the stabilizing deficit. For monetary policy, so in the case of South Africa here, we set up a standard Taylor rule, but we extend it with a foreign exchange market variable, so the depreciation rate, and so we identify the active monetary policy regime if the Taylor principle holds. So if the coefficient in front of inflation is larger than 1. In the application, it may be necessary to have a model a bit more complicated, just to elicit the sound monetary regime. So for instance, there may be an active regime with a high or low volatility, which would not be captured by the estimation if we didn't let it free. In the next step, we interact the fiscal regimes with the monetary regimes to create the 4 cases I talked about. Ideally, we would like to model them jointly, but in the case of South Africa, it's a bit too demanding on the available data. We have a companion paper on the United States, and this works pretty well. So there may be a bit of tweaking for South Africa for this. So to capture the responses of fiscal shocks to the sovereign yields, we then make use of the local projections that were developed by Horda in 2005 and popularized by Auerbach and Koronechenko. So basically what it does is a direct forecast of the dependent here, which is the difference in basis points of the sovereign yields, to a shock with a bunch of controls that capture the initial conditions of the shock. So what is interesting about the local projections is that we can read the impulse response function directly from the coefficient. So we run a regression for each horizon of the impulse response. So we can read the impulse response directly, and also the inference with the standard errors attached to the coefficients. When we interact it with the regime, the whole part of, the right-hand side of the equation is interacted with the regime probabilities. So coming to the results and the identification of the fiscal policy regime. So we identify, as I said, the fiscal policy, the fiscal passive and fiscal active. There's been three episodes of fiscal activism in the data. Namely 75, 76, from 86 to 94, and from 2008 to 2012. So these regimes are well anchored in the literature, either mentioning fiscal loosening, fiscal tightening, or even narrative. In terms of narrative, there is a clear link between what the regimes that we see here and what commentators have found for South Africa. For monetary policy, we do the same, and we see that that monetary activism is did not start at the onset. Did not need inflation targeting to be active. So roughly half of the sample, the South Africa Reserve Bank fought fiercely inflation. Again, those regimes are, I mean, fit what the literature has found. Just to graphically show the regimes, the interaction of the regimes here along the years, you may be surprised to see that that monetary activism is still present well into 2010, but the response to inflation is, I mean, either through an increase in inflation, but also a decrease in inflation. So here it means that the rate fell more than proportionally to inflation development. So we should not be too surprised that that we're still in active well into the global financial crisis. Just to fix ideas, those are the shock series. So the shock series are the residuals from the fiscal policy rule that we estimate, and I colored the regime. I mean the shocks depending on the regimes. What we can already see is that when fiscal policy is active, the size of the shocks is larger. So either here in purple or in blue. Yeah. So. So just to give a point of comparison, I present here the yield response to deficit shocks, but in the linear case. So for each quarter of the response, I plot the value of the coefficient and the standard error. So these are the impulse response of the yields. And what we see is that in the linear case, there's, I mean, absolutely no response of yields to fiscal policy. It does not mean that there's no response. It simply means that in a linear fashion, it's important. I mean, we are not able to detect a response of sovereign yields to fiscal policy shocks. Now, if we split the sample between the fiscal activism and fiscal passive, sorry, I forgot to mention that the interaction takes place at the initial conditions. So I do not know at horizon H whether I'm in regime FA or FB, and that's not what we want to show. It's really what happens in a shock when, at the moment of the shock, we are in a fiscal activity or fiscal passive regime. So here what we see is that the response is really regime specific. The response is even quite large in the fiscal active case, where in fiscal passive the response is smaller, but even not significant. Although for longer maturities, the story is a bit less clear cut. Now, if I interact the fiscal regimes with the monetary policy regime, so the first column is fiscal policy irrespective of monetary policy stance, and right column is fiscal active irrespective of the monetary policy stance. Same goes for the row. So the first quadrant here on the top left, if I compare it to the one in the first row and second column, what I see is that if I move from FP to FA, the response of yields is higher. So given monetary policy passive, the response of yields is higher in FA rather than in FP, and the same goes when monetary policy is active. So if I move, so given monetary policy active, moving from FB to FA, the response of yields is much larger. So in terms of magnitude, the magnitude is also quite large. So in the FA, monetary active, fiscal active regime, a 1% increase in the deficit increases the yields by 80 basis points. Forgot to mention that the shocks are standardized, so all the shocks that take place have the same size, so we can compare the magnitude across regime. So this is the response for short maturities. For longer maturities, the story is again a bit different. So what we show here is that we have presented economically grounded regimes stemming from fiscal and monetary policy in the framework of LEAPR. We have uncovered some important swings in policy preferences, and those policy preferences imply different responses of sovereign yields in South Africa. So just to sum up the results, yield responses are higher in fiscal activism than in fiscal passive, irrespective of monetary policy, and yields responses are higher in monetary activism than in monetary policy passive, irrespective of fiscal policy. So obviously, the combination of MA and FA yield a very high response of yields. So these results, I would say, are very important to government, because they would know what to expect when they engage in fiscal expansion packages, when they know the regime in which they are. The results also point to some maturity-specific response. So I believe there should be a need for a more comprehensive yield curve modeling framework. And finally, yeah, I think that this finding contribute to the debate about the macroeconomic impacts of fiscal policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a few questions. Eric, okay, Eric, you can go first. Then Andrea, if you can first, Eric. Yeah.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. One is the labeling of active and passive. It shouldn't just come off of the response, say, of the interest rate to inflation. It's really about the response of the interest rate to all nominal things. And since you have exchange rates in there, I think you need to be a little bit more careful about whether monetary policy is active or not. It's easy to show that in a theoretical model. With the empirical one, I think, you're going to have to think it through, see what the response of the interest rate is to the exchange rate as well as to inflation. The second thing is, do you have results for what I assume that the regime switching is exogenous here? And yes. If that's the case, then what is the ergodic distribution of regime? In other words, where does the economy end up if you stop perturbing regimes? You understand what I'm asking?
Not really.
Well, you can use the transition probabilities to compute kind of what the unconditional distribution is. And that will tell you whether, in the long run, you're in an active passive or passive active or what have you. I'm a little worried because, you're getting really big differences in the doubly active regime. And we kind of understand that you can't stay in that regime forever. And so I want to make sure that your estimates don't put you there too long.
Thank you. I mean, this is exactly what in theory that would be problematic, right? That when both are active, then we would have an explosive path. So I mean, so hopefully empirically this is also what we see. But yeah, I will look into that. Yeah, thank you.
Actually, let me just add one final thing. When I think about these regimes, what matters is not simply the shock, but the coefficients in the policy rules and how
Right.
they generate dynamics. The local projections technique kind of throws those coefficients away and focuses only on the shock. And I'm wondering whether you've thought through the implications of that. So local projections may make perfectly sound good sense if you have a fixed regime. But because regime can change, there are these expectational effects that, you know, you're in some regime today, but everyone knows you could go somewhere else tomorrow. That affects the dynamics through the coefficients on the policy rules.
Right. I mean,
you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I mean, I think that local projections, since I mean, since we don't control for the regime at horizon H, I mean, it could be that you know, at horizon 1 we are in the FP, and then back in at horizon 5 into FA, and then at 15 we're back at FP. So I mean, we control for the initial state, but whatever happens before that would be captured by the I mean the probability switches.
See, what I'm getting at is if instead of using local projections, you had embedded this into a regime switching VAR,
right?
Then you would be able to condition on which regime you're in, and you'd be able to know more about what's generating these results. And I think that's if you wanted to give good policy advice, you need to be able to say more than what the current regime is. You want to know, okay, you're following this policy and we're assuming you're going to stay in that policy for some period of time. You see what I'm saying? And I don't think the local projections can give you that information.
I mean, in another paper, this is exactly what we have a VR with different regime switching. It was just too complicated for for the computer to compute all the tree, because yeah, at each period it's I mean, you have to compute all the possible path, but yeah, I mean, this is something that that we would explore.
Just on that point, Talja has some code that you might be able to adapt. It's in C or C++, but it comes from his model with Chris Sims, where they did monetary switching.
Right. Yeah, I see.
So it's massively complicated, but that might be the direction you're kind of forced to go in.
Thank you very much.
Andrea.
Thanks, Olivier. So the one thing that stood out for me was it seems like, at least from an impact on your yields, the kind of the optimal scenario is one where you don't try to stabilize debt. In other words, fiscal passive. Right. You don't follow a Taylor rule, monetary passive. So that, I mean, that's really counterintuitive, right? And so what do you think about that? Why do you think that's the case? Yeah, how do you square that circle?
But I mean, in the MPFP, there would be debt stabilization, because the FP tries to stabilize that. So that
I'm
would
sorry,
fit
I thought fiscal passive was one where you don't trust stabilized debt. Have I got that wrong?
So yeah, I mean it's a bit difficult to understand. So when it's fiscal passive, you try to stabilize the debt, but you try to stabilize inflation when it's monetary active.
Okay, sorry. Okay, thanks for clarifying.
So I mean, in that case, that would be the MPFA in the case that you're referring to. So you don't target the debt, debt stabilization or even debt reduction, and you don't want to. I mean, you don't target inflation either. That would be so. Yeah, that would be the regimes, the blue regime on the screen.
Okay, thank you.
But this, if I can maybe add to Andre, but is exactly the issue. Therefore, the regime of the diagonal here,
yes,
are the one that are indeterminate.
Yeah, on the top left one, yes. This is the one that theoretically is indeterminate, yes.
The top left, or the one on the diagonal are the one that are indeterminate.
So the red one on the top left is indeterminate. The one on the bottom right is explosive.
Explosive. Okay, therefore the one that there is no effect on the interest rate are the stabilizing one. That it doesn't matter either you give responsibility to monetary policy or give responsibility of a fiscal policy, as long as the other instrument follow the original instrument, there is no problem. When you when both try to one stabilizing interest inflation and the other using fiscal policy actively, that is the first one, or they're both active passive.
Yeah.
And this one is the fact of a deficit shock. Now, therefore, in the first case, you have monetarization in the top, at the top end, and at the bottom end, you will have explosive debt. Yeah. And you don't have an effect on the other macroeconomic variable of this out of.
Yes.
Yeah, you have
so yeah, so those would be the responses. Those are the responses of of GDP, GDP and CPI on the next slide. So you tell me which one you want to see.
No. Yeah. Well, okay. No. Yes. Therefore, you have the. But okay. But I wanted actually to ask another question on the monetary regime, to go back a bit on what Eric was saying. Because you're looking for this long period, the long period from 1970, you have very different monetary policy rules in this period. You go almost from, exchange rate. Essentially, you don't have a Taylor rule until the 2000. Before, as a monetary exchange rate targeting, or how do you? Therefore, if I do an exchange rate targeting, in which sense is a monetary active policy? Because I am targeting exchange rate independently of what the internal element is.
Right. So technically, what I would do would be to add a new regime and apply the restrictions on the coefficients of the exchange rate. And I mean, linked to what Eric said. So to have a comprehensive set of identifying restrictions per regime. So yes, I mean, to come back to your point, yes. So we have a Taylor rule. I mean, quite that goes quite far back. But here we frame it to, I mean, a rule that fights inflation. It doesn't. It's not necessarily a rule that is meant to summarize the behavior of the reserve bank, but more a rule that allows us to elicit period where they fought inflation with whichever instrument. I mean, although interest rate is not the instrument, but you know, money growth and then interest rates can go hand in hand. So yeah, so this would be a way to elicit periods of yes, fighting inflation, irrespective of the instrument used.
Hilton and Eric is coming back. Hilton now.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. Olivier, unfortunately, I missed the beginning. I was still getting some peanuts, so I missed the beginning, and I didn't see a model specification or how exactly you define deficits. But just then a quick comment, and then, I mean, you can respond if you want. I had a lot of trouble with using the deficit data to identify fiscal policy shocks, and the signs direction were counterintuitive. You know, we have the big deficit spending that took place around the global financial crisis as well. So just a quick, if you already touched on it, then don't talk about it. Just tell me, and then I'll get in touch with you. But did you? You used the primary deficit, that one. Okay, great. And then up is a deficit. Okay, great. So I just wanted to check that. And then, did you think about using other, you know, like I mentioned in my presentation, using, you know, debt to GDP or some other kind of indicator of the fiscal policy stance, or at least whether or not it's expansionary or contractionary? And then the other thing is that it's quite interesting, your fiscal active, if you go down to your other graph, yeah, no, back up. One more. Yeah, it looks to me like where monetary policy was passive and fiscal active, that took, I don't know about 75, but I know 85, 86, and around there was debt restructuring that took place in South Africa. And then obviously, then you had the first kind of rounds of consolidation attempts after the global financial crisis. So just your thinking there, I mean, it seems to be the regime is also heavily state dependent, you know, on the environment at the time, or what was needed. Now, obviously, this is controlled for by the other variables, but would you expect then that, you know, this fiscal activism, which here would be assuming that the fiscal policy is kind of targeting inflation as well in that period? That's the kind of definition there of monetary passive, fiscal active, is that they're stabilizing debt and inflation. I mean, how do you reconcile that with the agenda at the time was that it was about, you know, debt restructuring in 85, 86? I don't know if you picked up anything else. Did you kind of dig into it a little bit to explain? I know you brushed over it by referencing to the other literature and the monetary policy activism, but did you think about the fiscal policy activism here as well?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, so I was too quick on this. So the idea was to I mean, once we have the regime, to, I mean, try and see what the literature was saying in terms of the narrative behind it. And I mean, what we saw was confirmed by the literature. So that, I mean, that was the thought process. So if I understand your question correctly, also with the, you know, is the Markov switching really exogenous? So would it be responding to another an observed state that we could have, and that this would yeah, I mean, this would condition the switching probabilities in that case. And for the, I mean, for building the deficit, yeah, so it was simply a calculation. The headline balance. We found the interest payments and we simply subtracted them. So no big transformations transformations there.
Eric, you want to come back in?
Yeah, I just want to, this may surprise you to hear, but I think this active passive language sometimes isn't all that helpful.
Yeah, it's your fault. It's you invented it.
Well, the thing is that the way I originally defined these was that an active authority pursues whatever its objective is in an unconstrained manner. And then the passive authority has to behave in a way that it's constrained both by the active authority and by private sector behavior. Unfortunately, in the simple model I looked at, everything maps into just two policy parameters, and it all looks nice and clean. So I might suggest that you drop that language and instead talk about what the authorities are actually trying to do.
Right.
Are they aggressively targeting inflation or the exchange rate or what have you? And move away from the active passive, because it's clear that people are confused by it. And I think in some ways you're stumbling over it, because then you get stuck with having to explain these explosive regimes and blah, 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 right? And that's all a very model specific point, which isn't what you're doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So unless you're going to stick this in a formal model, where then suddenly this issue of indeterminacy or non-existence of equilibrium becomes relevant, I think you just end up creating more confusion than you need to. So I would focus on, the other thing I would also urge you to do, you mentioned it, is put some heteroskedasticity in.
Mm-hmm.
I think that can change the identification quite dramatically, and it may address what Hilton was just talking about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maybe if I could just quickly dovetail on that. What's interesting is in the model, in the presentation Roy was giving, what's actually comes out of that is that when fiscal policy is optimal in the stabilization sense and just concerned with output in the primary balance, this actually achieves the same objective of the monetary authority in the model and given the data. And I think that's almost kind of what I'm seeing here. We didn't use the language active passive there. But I think that by construction, if primary balance sustainability or fiscal sustainability requires primary balance adjustments that are demand stabilizing. And then this tends to lead to the same outcome not exactly, but coincides at least. And that's something interesting. If you're interested, we can share. I can share that work with you at a later stage.
Yeah.
Any more questions, anybody? That's great. Okay, if there is no
Thank you very much for all the questions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the comments and questions.
Thank you very much.